Our reading this morning comes from Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 to 13, and you can find that on page 973 in your church Bible. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners."
If you've got a Bible, do turn back to that passage that Abby kindly read for us earlier in the service. There's something beautiful, isn't there, about coming along to a baptism service, as Amy has spoken of, talking and seeing someone testify to their faith in Jesus Christ and then stepping out in obedience to his words. It's beautiful, that symbol of leaving an old life behind and following Christ. But the privilege does not start as they step into the icy, dark, cold water that is Akeman Street Baptist Church's baptistry pool. It starts long before. One of the incredible privileges and joys of being a minister is you just get the time to sit with people and to hear their stories of how they came to faith in Jesus. And it was a great privilege to do that with Peter and with Amy. I'm going to mention Peter's story a little bit later on in the service, but when I met with Amy and we talked, two words particularly jumped out to me of Amy's testimony, and maybe you picked them up as well. There's a sense that Amy's story is all about surprise and providence. Surprise and providence. When Amy and I met the other week in the Espresso Lounge, and of course other coffee shops are available, she shared with me a little bit about that story. How she'd went to church, how she'd been christened, how she'd heard about Jesus before, but then she went to that christening. And she and Nick on the way home said, wow, they had heard Jesus spoken of in a way they had never heard before. It was a moment of surprise. And then there's providence. As Amy spoke a moment ago, she is able to tell how God, in his kindness, placed certain people in her lives at just the right time. Even the fact that they ended up at this church and not another church is God's providential playbook on full display. Amy shared with me the first Sunday that they came here, they actually hadn't intended to come here. Amy just didn't want to get in the car that morning. And so they left the car and they walked up the road from her parents' house to this church. And the rest, as they say, is history. Amy's story is a story about surprise and providence. God placing people in her path so that just the right time, she is surprised as she encounters Jesus Christ. And I wondered, did you pick up on the reality that was the same thing in our Bible reading? There is Matthew, a tax collector, going about his ordinary life, sitting at his tax collecting booth, when all of a sudden, in the providence of God, there comes the surprising Jesus. And what Jesus does surprises not only Matthew, but everyone there that day. Because in this time, in this world, people like Matthew did not get invited in, they got written off and kept out. But here comes the surprising Jesus, and the text says he looks at Matthew, not through the lens of his past or his present, not even through the label of his occupation, but he looks at him with sovereign grace, and he says, "Follow me." So friends, follow me this morning and meet this surprising Jesus, and leave realizing that what he has done in Matthew's life, what he has done in Amy's life, what he has done in Peter's life, be sure he can do in your life. Now, I know we've got some friends this morning from different denominational backgrounds, and there is that well-worn-out stereotype, isn't there? The Baptist minister with his nicely, neatly three-point alliterated sermon with a poem. I don't have that this morning. I don't have 3 points. I've got 8. They are alliterated because I'm a Baptist and I cannot help myself, so please do pray. But come with me this morning. We're going to encounter a surprising Jesus through 8 steps. I'm not even joking, there are actually 8. And it begins as we come to a surprising collision. If you've got your Bible open, you'll see just before our passage, you have that famous moment, don't you? Where 4 friends' passion for evangelism turns into vandalism. 4 friends are so desperate to get their buddy to Jesus, they climb up onto a roof and they rip it apart. And the first thing Jesus did in that moment was not to heal the man's legs, but to forgive his sins. And to show to everyone there that day he actually has the power to forgive the thing they cannot see, he shows them he has physically the power to sort the man's legs out. Matthew is telling us there that Jesus has this power not just to heal bodies, but to forgive souls and minds, to make people born again. And notice with me, straight after that moment, we see Jesus' power is so strong and powerful that he can even fix scumbag tax collectors like Matthew. For notice as we transition out of verse 8 into verse 9, it's like Jesus opens the door of that house with a hole in the ceiling where he's just pronounced forgiveness, and straight away his path and the path of Matthew collide together. And so you could imagine it for Matthew. He's sitting at his tax booth, minding his own business on a normal day when all of a sudden his ordinary day becomes a God-ordained collision. And I want you to notice this morning, that is not just something we observe in the Bible. It's something we recognize in Amy's story and Peter's story and many others. God, in his providence, places people into our lives, friends and families, even through Christian camps, Airbnbs, so that become the very means in which our paths and the path of Christ collide together. And notice with me, as Jesus' path and the path of this tax collector intersect, as Matthew sits at his tax collecting booth, this guy is not just doing an unpopular job like the person always handing out car parking tickets in M&S car park. No, he's doing something far more serious. At this point in history, Israel is under Roman occupation, and Rome held grip through taxation, power, and control. And so to be a tax collector was to be in part working for a corrupt system. A system which people would enrich themselves and Rome through the suffering of their own people. So Matthew here is not just unpopular. This is a guy who has effectively sold his soul to the devil that is Rome. In fact, so despised are the religious elite what Jesus is doing there. They kick off in verse 11. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? So here in verse 8, on the busy streets of Capernaum, the path of Jesus collides with Matthew's. And as it does, Jesus is not just walking into some morally neutral setting. This guy is not just grinding out a living. He's someone who's compromised, whose label, who's been written off. Everyone is repulsed by Matthew, but Jesus is not. Jesus moves towards him. And as he does, he makes the declaration, grace, his grace is not just for the respectable. It's for the wretched, for those who have wrecked it. Don't believe me? Well, notice what happens, because the surprising collision leads to an even more surprising call. There in verse 9, the path of Jesus intersects, collides with Matthew's, and the writer tells us that Jesus saw Matthew. And that is not just him saying that there is Jesus surveying the scene and noticing in his peripheral vision a guy sitting at his tax collecting booth. No, this is more than sight. This is a look that penetrates. This is a searching gaze that goes beyond the surface. So can you imagine in that sense being this tax collector, sitting at your tax collecting booth, doing what you've always done, surveying the scene to see who you could scam next walking down the road, when all of a sudden here comes Jesus, surrounded by his gaggle of disciples, and he stops and he looks. Not around you, not past you, not through you, but at you. And as the eyes of Matthew and the eyes of Yeshua meet, you have got to begin to wonder what rises in Matthew's heart. Guilt? Regret? Shame? The weight of everything he's done, everything he's become, everything he's been called. And friends, if it's not shocking enough that Jesus would enter into Matthew's world, what follows next is out of this world, because verse 9 says Jesus' first words to the scumbag: follow me. Follow me. You can imagine it, can't you? In the next moment, Peter, the disciple who always puts his foot in it, edges closer to Jesus and says, Jesus, I don't want to disturb this nice moment, but are you aware of who this guy is? Do you know where he sits, Jesus? Do you know what he's done? Jesus, do you know who he works for? Sure, we're not the most elite ourselves, fishermen and tradesmen, rough around the edges for sure, but Jesus, this guy's different. This guy sold out his own people. He's in bed with the enemy. You wouldn't really call someone like that Jesus, would you? You could so easily imagine that being verse 10. Everyone had written this guy off. Yet here stands God in the flesh, Jesus Christ, not distant, not detached, not issuing out terms and conditions, but real and personally calling a sinner to himself. Follow me. And friends, that is the staggering beauty of the Christian faith. Jesus does not step back from mess. He steps into it. He doesn't here wait for Matthew to clean himself up. He calls him right where he is. Because Jesus is not just some moral, distant teacher observing brokenness from afar, but he is the God-man who enters into the mess of our world and the mess of our lives in order to redeem what we could never repair. So yes, this is a surprising call, but in another sense, when you understand Jesus, this is not a surprise at all. Because what do we read in the Gospels? Here is Christ who comes for the last, the lost, the least. Here is the one who calls fishermen from their nets, tax collectors from their tables, prostitutes from street corners, and he welcomes them in. And notice in verse 9, the call from Jesus is not delayed and it's not qualified. Jesus does not say in verse 9, fix yourself up and then you can follow. Or clean up your reputation, your street cred, and then you can follow. Or go and make amends and then we'll talk. No, he calls him right in the middle of the mess of his life, right at the tax collecting booth. Come and follow me. And notice the surprising call then leads to a surprising commitment. I recently heard the testimony the other day of a lady who worked in the porn industry. She's on a plane, she's heading out to shoot the next porno. The night before she leaves, she feels this conviction to pack a Bible that had been given to her by a church a number of years ago. She hadn't read it in ages. She put that Bible in her bag, and there in the middle of the flight, she opens it. She meets Jesus Christ, and on the plane, in the middle of the mess of her life, she gives her life to Jesus Christ. And she walks away from everything. The money, the career, the identity, she goes all in on Jesus. Notice here is Matthew in the middle of his life. He's not cleaned up, not fixed, not ready. He's sitting at the tax booth, the place that defines him and defiles him. And it is to that very place that Christ meets him and says, come and follow me. And Dr. Luke, in his historical account of this moment, adds a bit more weight to it, because he tells us Matthew got up, left everything behind, and followed. Everything. Not just the few coins on the table, but the career, the security, the identity. This is a burning of the boats moment. There is now no plan B for Matthew. Here is a man leaving a lucrative career in the civil service as he goes all in on Jesus. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed. And notice then, as we transition from verse 9 into verse 10, we're transported from the tax collecting table to a dining room table. as we move from a moment of commitment into a surprising celebration. Verse 10 tells us that Jesus is now having dinner at Matthew's house. And do not sanitize that scene. This is not a Baptist church having a bring and share lunch where one or two Christians got too giddy after a glass of Schlur. No, this is an ex-tax collector meeting with his mates. This is loud, this is noisy, there's drink, there's laughter, there's movement. And the disciples probably feel like fish out of water, fishermen out of water. But you can imagine it, can't you? Being one of those guys, walking around. This is the very man who was taken from your own people. This is the system that is squeezing your nation dry. In fact, this guy probably has stung you once before about some new Roman legislation about fish sizes that you have to pay more taxes. And you're walking around his house and everything is telling a story. The cars in the drive, the chandeliers coming down from the ceiling, the aged wine and whiskey. And in your head, you're probably thinking, my tax is paid for this. And in the middle of that, there's Jesus, reclining at the table. Not keeping his distance, not on the edge of the party, not keeping himself clean from the room, but at the table. Because here's what the Gospels make unmistakably clear. Jesus never condones sin, but he's not afraid to be near sinners. And maybe even the more surprising thing, it's not that just sinners are in his presence, but sinners love to be in the presence of Jesus. So you can picture it in verse 10, the disciples feeling a bit disorientated, Jesus laughing at the table, and once more, like always, the religious people are on the edge, muttering under their breath. Because we see, fifthly, a surprising criticism. Here's Jesus dining at the table. And in Jesus' day, to do lunch was to do theology on the table. To sit down with someone was to say, you are not an outsider to me. So here is a collision. Grace is sitting at the table of sinners. And for the religious people of the day, they've got a problem. Not with the concept of a table, but what this table of verse 10 is declaring. Because the religious people who are kicking off, the text tells us, are the Pharisees. They knew the promises, they knew the prophetic imagery, the hope that had been carried through their history. They knew what the prophet Isaiah had declared in chapter 25 of a coming day where the Lord will throw a feast for his people, where God will meet with his people around his table in the world that is to come. And what is happening in front of them? What are these religious men watching? Well, here is a man who in the first verses of this chapter has openly declared divine authority. And what is he now doing? He's sitting at a table with a great banquet, with a gathering of people. And the echoes are intentional. They are loaded with Old Testament resonance. And here's the thing that unsettles the religious leaders. Not that there's a meal, but their problem is, who's the guests at the meal? Because instead of the acceptable people like them gathered around the table of the king, verse 10 tells us that Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners. So they start to grumble. Because when the Messiah comes, he's not doing the sorts of things they had rehearsed. So they're not only confused, they're angry. Angry at the idea not of grace at the table, but by who grace has now invited. Friends, whether you've been around church your whole life or you're pretty new to this, notice this morning Jesus gathers all kinds of people to his table. And while religious voices might say, there's no place for someone like you, Jesus here is saying, come and pull up a chair. Because notice, no one earns a seat at Jesus' table. A chair is not achieved, it is given. And it is prepared for you by none other than the King of glory himself. So come and follow me, says Jesus. Notice what is happening in this surprising criticism. Jesus is blowing apart the idea that religion has, that sinners are not allowed near. Here is Jesus saying there is a place for my table for someone like you. So notice here a surprising collision leads to a surprising call that produced a surprising commitment that gives way to a surprising celebration, which then provokes this surprising criticism, and into that Jesus responds with a surprising condition. Notice at the beginning of verse 9, Matthew 9, Jesus had pronounced the man's sins to be forgiven. And the religious leaders kick off because they thought it was blasphemous. Only God can forgive sins. And they start thinking these things in their minds, and before they ever speak them aloud directly, Jesus responds to their thoughts. And now notice once again a complaint is coming from the religious elite, not now spoken in their thoughts, but spoken out loud to the disciples. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? And the same Jesus who reads the hidden reasonings of their hearts now responds to this open criticism. Notice what he says, verse 12, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus is not saying that he has come to exclude religious people, but rather Jesus is exposing there is a kind of self-confidence religiously that makes someone on the outside look healthy while being deeply undersick internally. Because the truth is there is only one who is truly righteous, and the Pharisees, they'd convinced themselves they were well. Because after all, they're morally active, religiously committed, externally impressive, but Jesus knows they are spiritually disconnected from him, the only one who can make them right with God. So Jesus is pressing the issue. He has not come for people who think they're righteous in themselves. He has come for those who know they are not. That is why the imagery works. Sick people go to the doctor because they know they need help. So Jesus is saying to these people, it is not the problem that sinners are near me. No, the problem is you Pharisees will not admit that you are sick. So you keep your distance. But Matthew, he has come and he has followed me. Friends, the Bible would say to all of us this morning, without Jesus Christ, we are like Matthew and these religious leaders. We are spiritually sick. And our souls deep down feel it and know it. That is why Amy had an ache that the things of this world could not satisfy. And notice here, Jesus is not coming as a distant commentator, just pointing out the problem. No, here is the great physician. For after all, that is why he has come. So number 7, a surprising coming. What is Jesus doing here? Why, again and again in the Gospels, is Jesus hanging out with the last and the lost and the least? Why does he spend his time with fishermen and tax collectors and adulterers and prostitutes? Because let's be clear, it's not very often in the Gospels we read Jesus is with the religious people in the synagogue. He's often out chilling on the street corners. So why does he spend his time with these sorts of people? The answer is there in verse 13. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So here is Christ who enters into the mess. He calls the broken. He eats with the rejected because that is why he has come, to gather sinners to himself. So here is Christ entering into the messiness of Matthew's life because he's on a rescue mission. And he's on a mission that will take him through the Gospels to the cross, where Jesus will be despised and rejected, so that he can make a way for Matthew, for Amy, and for Peter, and for all who would come to him. So see the wonder of it this morning. It is not merely that Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners. It is that he's willing to become their substitute. The wonder is not that there's just a place at Matthew's table for Jesus, but that he has made a place for Matthew at his. Because here is Christ who doesn't just welcome sinners, he bears the weight of their sin. And in his death, he opens wide the door for all who would come to him. So here is Matthew in the middle of the messiness of his life. And yet, verse 9, Jesus calls him. because Jesus does not demand progress before he offers presence. But notice with me, when a sinner's path collides with Jesus, it begins to change them, slowly but surely. And that change is not the means of their salvation, it is the overflow of it. Because grace does not just forgive you where you are and leave you there, it refuses to keep you where you once were. And so lastly, a surprising change. What happened to the guy at the beginning of Matthew 9? What did he go on to do? Who did he become? Well, the text does not tell us. But we don't have to ask the same question with this tax collector. Because in the next chapter, in chapter 10, we read that Jesus calls his 12 disciples to himself, and then he sends them out with his authority. And we get a list of their names. And if you've got a Bible open, Matthew chapter 10, verse 3, whose name do you see? Matthew, the tax collector. What does Jesus do with a despised and rejected tax collector like Matthew? Well, let me put it to you like this. It's not a coincidence this morning we are in Matthew's gospel and we're hearing about someone called Matthew. That Matthew is this Matthew. That in the grace of God, Matthew the tax collector becomes Matthew, one of the 12 disciples, the apostle, the gospel writer. Here is the last person you would expect Jesus to go after, but he does, for this is what the surprising Jesus does. So Matthew's story reminds each of us this morning, churched and unchurched, no one has outsinned the grace of Jesus. And there is no sin in your life with more power than his cross. Because if Jesus can redeem and forgive an enemy and a traitor like Matthew, and if he can repurpose his life, then he can do the same for you. As we begin to draw things to a close, when I met with Peter, and I asked him the question, Peter, why do you want to be baptized? His response was simple but profound. He said, because I love Jesus and I want to show it to others. Friends, as we baptize Peter and Amy in a few moments, I need you to hear me really well this morning. They are not being baptized because they've checked enough religious boxes. They are not going to be getting in the water because they're morally impressive or somehow church attendance has manipulated God into liking them. If you want to see how great the grace of God is, see this. Peter supports Liverpool. He has come to seek and save the lost. Friends, the only reason they are being baptized this morning is because the Spirit of God has collided with their lives and confronted them with Jesus. They were once spiritually sick, in desperate need of Christ. And by sheer grace, Jesus found them. And in this very physical act of going in the water and under the water, and maybe up out of the water, they are showing something has already taken place. Jesus has changed them. They are already his. But he is continuing to change them. And what he has done for them, be sure he can do for you. So the question I close with is not, have you fixed yourself this morning? And it's not, are you religious enough? And it's not, do you have all your doubts sorted or every theological duck in a row? The question is right where you are, right in the middle of your mess, your tax collecting booth, whatever it looks like for you this morning, Jesus through his word says, follow me. So the question is, will you this morning recognize that you're spiritually sick? And notice this, Jesus is not waiting for you to polish yourself up first, or become a better version, or have every theological question answered first. Right as it was for Matthew, it is for you in the midst of whatever is going on in your life. Right now, friend, this hour, this day, in this moment, Jesus, through his word and spirit, says to you, follow me. And if you follow, he says in his word, he will never turn you aside. For here is Christ the King, who does not recoil at brokenness, but he moves towards it. And why? Because he's not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Sinners like Matthew, sinners like Amy, Sinners like Peter, sinners like me, and sinners like each of you. So friends, will you come? Will you come to Christ the King?